are the most racist. You hear these opinions from majority of the time members of the dominant group. Generally, it's a cop out. In this video, we're going to break down what is racism, what is discrimination, what is prejudice. And you'll hear believers in the community, oh, you can't be racist and be a Christian or a believer, which I agree. However, how the definition of racism is utilized, it completely diminishes the realities of African Americans in the United States and systemic inequality realities that we are faced with. It's a strategy to keep the African American unskillful and oriented in a state of ignorance, lying to themselves. When white identity extremists say Christians can't be racist, but then turn around and label African Americans as racist for naming their lived realities, there's a contradiction hiding in plain sight. On one hand, they appeal to a spiritual ideal, freedom from hatred and partiality. On the other hand, they silence the very people describing real patterns of harm. So pause and ask yourself, are you using theology to pursue truth or to avoid discomfort? Because when someone names what they are experiencing across generations, whether it be housing disparities, unequal treatment, uneducational or educational gaps, that is not hatred, that is testimony. And silencing testimony doesn't produce unity, it produces erasure. Scripture never calls you to deny reality, it calls you to confront it in truth. Luke 4:18 shows Christ declaring his mission to proclaim freedom for the captives, to set the oppressed free. That's Luke 4:18. He didn't deny oppression. He named it. He didn't dismiss suffering. He stepped into it. John 14:6 says he is the truth, not a selective version of the truth. And Isaiah 1:17 commands, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed. So what does it mean if someone tells you that acknowledging systemic injustice is somehow unchristian? Is it really more faithful to ignore patterns of harm or to bring them into the light where healing can begin? Christ didn't walk past brokenness pretending it wasn't there. He addressed it directly. There's also a deeper implication when minorities are told they must deny racial realities for the sake of your faith. What's being implied is this: you don't have the right to interpret your own experience. You don't have the right to name what you see. You don't have the right to equip yourself or your children to navigate a world that treats you differently. That's not spiritual formation, that's control. Because if you can convince someone to ignore the system shaping their outcomes, you keep them unprepared to respond to them. But truth equips, truth sharpens, truth allows you to move with wisdom. So ask yourself, if race truly doesn't matter, why does it consistently predict outcomes? Why is it documented, tracked, and measurable across systems? And if it is real in its impact, why would acknowledging it be considered a threat to faith? And here's where the line needs to be drawn clearly. Christianity and racism are incompatible at the level of values. You cannot uphold systems of oppression and claim allegiance to truth and love. But calling Black individuals or other marginalized groups racist for naming injustice distorts the conversation. It shifts focus away from systems and onto the people affected by them. That's not accountability, that's deflection. Ephesians 5:11 says, have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. Exposure requires honesty, not denial. So the real question for the dominant group becomes, are you willing to examine systems that may benefit you at the expense of others? Are you open to truth, even when it disrupts your narrative? Or does labeling others as racist protect you from having to look deeper in yourselves? Because truth doesn't just comfort, it confronts. And this is the reality. A lot of white identity extremists have a hard time with truth. And the truth is, we live in an economy and a human society that is socially engineered around race. That's the reality. And for believers to address it and to name it is to be skillful, is to hopefully identify solutions, but you first have to recognize that there's a problem. Racism is more than individual attitudes. It is a system of power that shapes how opportunities, resources, and protections are distributed across society. You have to look at a lot of concepts and terms that you use in levels. Racism would be almost like the enterprise, it would be like the larger system. And the different companies, those represent sort of offshoots of the enterprise where you'll have discrimination, you'll have prejudice, you'll have alienation, all these other terms that are essentially children or offspring of racism. Racism isn't just one thing, it expresses itself in many different ways at a larger scale. So it says here, racism is more than individual attitudes. It is a system of power that shapes how opportunities, resources, and protections are distributed across society. At its core, racism involves a historically rooted infrastructure that privileges a dominant group. In the United States, that's predominantly white populations while disadvantaging others based on race. This system shows up in patterns, not just isolated incidents, such as disparities in housing access, school funding, hiring practices, healthcare outcomes, and criminal justice treatment. When you look at racism through this lens, you begin to see that it is not only about what someone believes, but about how entire systems are structured in ways that consistently benefit one group while excluding or marginalizing others. Prejudice and discrimination operate on a different level. Prejudice refers to attitudes or beliefs, what you think or feel about a group. Can some black people be prejudiced? Absolutely. Absolutely. There's no denial about that. And I think that's what white identity extremists are trying to say. Like, black people can be prejudiced, right? Like that's the truth. But racist, that's a system. You don't have enough African American representation in the systems of government, law enforcement, enterprise for them to be labeled as racist. What groups are they marginalizing? What groups are African Americans excluding from infrastructure? They don't own any part of the infrastructure and a small percentage of the wealth. So that's a misnomer when you label African Americans as racist. But can they be prejudiced? Absolutely. Can they have attitudes or beliefs that are biased or harmful towards other groups? Absolutely. Absolutely. Prejudice refers to attitudes or beliefs, what you think or feel about a group. For example, you might assume someone is dangerous, lazy, or less capable based on their race. Discrimination, on the other hand, is behavior, how those beliefs are acted out. This could look like refusing to hire someone, treating them unfairly, or excluding them socially. Both are harmful, but they do not automatically equal racism unless they are backed by systemic power. A person can hold prejudiced beliefs or even act in discriminatory ways without having the institutional authority to enforce those beliefs across systems like housing markets, legal systems, or educational structures. This is where a lot of confusion and tension comes. It comes in when people claim that Black individuals are racist. It's important to slow that down. Black individuals, like any group, can absolutely hold prejudice or even discriminate on an interpersonal level. But racism, in its systemic sense, requires power embedded in institutions that can enforce exclusion at a scale. Historically and currently, Black communities in the United States have not held dominant control over these systems. So when the term racism is used interchangeably with prejudice, It flattens the conversation and ignores the structural reality. So when you hear white identity extremists calling people racist, black people are racist, black people are racist, black people are so racist, this is a cop out and a way for them to ignore the systemic inequalities in the United States and to allow the system to continue on where some groups benefit, other groups don't. Sometimes labeling Black individuals as racist becomes a way to deflect from or minimize ongoing systemic inequalities, shifting the focus from institutional accountability to individual behavior. If you want a more accurate and productive conversation, it helps to separate these layers. What someone believes, that's prejudice, how they act is discrimination, and what systems enforce is racism. Just so that way you have that education. So let's look here. When people say Christians cannot be racist, which is accurate, they're usually pointing to an ideal, what a life shaped by Christ should look like. Scripture calls you to love your neighbor, Mark 12:31, to show no partiality, James 2:1, and to walk in humility. But here's the tension. Christianity does not call you to deny reality. It calls you to confront it with truth and transformation. If racism exists not only in hearts but in systems, then claiming immunity simply because of your faith can become a form of spiritual bypassing. You're not just called to believe rightly, you're called to see rightly. And that means asking yourself, am I defining righteousness in a way that protects my comfort or in a way that reflects truth, even when it challenges me? The Bible consistently anchors believers in truth as a foundational value. John 8:32 says, you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. Ephesians 4:25 calls you to put away falsehood and speak truth. Proverbs 12:22 reminds you that lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who act faithfully are his delight. Truth in both biblical and secular definitions is about alignment with reality. Dictionaries define truth as that which is in accordance with fact or reality. In the body of real things, events, and facts. So if truth is reality, then ignoring observable patterns like racial disparities in housing, education, employment, and justice is not neutrality. It's avoidance. And avoidance dressed up as spirituality is still avoidance. Here's the uncomfortable but necessary layer. You live in a socially engineered world where race is not just a concept, it's a category that shapes experience. You may wish it didn't matter, but wishing doesn't erase structure. Race is embedded in systems, data collection, and institutional processes. It shows up in who gets approved for loans, who is more likely to be stopped by police, whose schools are funded differently, and whose resumes get callbacks. So ask yourself honestly, if race doesn't matter, why is it consistently tracked? Why is it consistently tracked? And this is where the warning matters. When dominant groups or white identity extremists push narratives that dismiss systemic racism, it can keep others unskilled in recognizing and responding to real barriers. Ignorance, lying, keeps people unskillful. Truth keeps you skillful, keeps you effective, because in order for you to be skillful and effective to navigate reality, you have to be able to accept reality and the facts that exist. That's where you are to be skillful. In order for you to be skillful in challenging negative thoughts, anxiety, and depression, you have to acknowledge the depression. You have to acknowledge the anxiety in order for you to be skillful in acknowledging how you're going to prepare for war. If there's a World War III, how you're going to protect your family. Do you have to move? Do you stay? How do you allocate resources? In order for you to be skillful, you have to acknowledge there's a war. You have to acknowledge there's a condition that's occurring right now where you may want to step it up in terms of your planning. So truth is necessary to be skillful. Lying keeps you unskillful. So when white identity extremists are saying Black people are racist, these people are racist, they want to keep Black people unskillful. They don't want you to be able to acknowledge the systemic inequalities in the structure so that way you can be able to navigate these systems effectively. If you don't see the systems, you can't engage it. If you don't name the pattern, you can't disrupt it. Christianity doesn't call you to ignore broken systems. It calls you to be a light within them, which requires awareness, courage, and truth. So the real question becomes, are you willing to hold truth and grace at the same time? Can you acknowledge a racially coded society without losing your commitment to love? Or does denying the problem feel easier than wrestling with it? Where are some areas where we discuss race, right? If this is such a issue that needs to be denied, where you're asking for race on job applications, In equal opportunity forms, you're asking what your race is, your nationality is. College and standardized testing, you have the little bubbles. What's your race? Alaska Native, right? Black. You're asking for your race on your SAT test, your ACT reporting. You're asking for race on your housing and your mortgage applications, right? For fair lending tracking, medical records, public health data collection. You're asking for race in government documents, census, voter registrations, certain licensing forms. I'm out.